important issues with a friend of America. I will introduce Gabe in a second, but first of all, our podcast is developing very well. I have uploaded no less than 11 videos today on my X account and more to come. And tomorrow we are going to the Munich Security Conference for this weekend, and we will be also live there for many occasions. And the aim is, of course, to enlarge the NATO, the free world, and to be very active in all the values and all the issues and all the crises and wars, which there are so many at the moment. And I'm now discussing with my new friend Gabe from America about Cuba, because that's of course a very big issue, because following the fall of Maduro and the American military intervention against Venezuelan tyranny, there is now the question, what will happen with Cuba? And we have it keeps us busy since 70 years, basically, this communist island, and we want to have freedom as well for the Cubans. Now I would like to introduce you, Gabe. He is a young political activist from the United States of America who has a Cuban background, like many, maybe from Florida. We will find out, and we will see. He's probably a fan of Marco Rubio. We will find out that one as well. And we want to welcome you, Gabe. Please. You are very welcome, and please introduce yourself and tell us who you are.
Thank you very much, Gunther. Yeah, so my name is Gabe Cooley. I'm a college student. I'm from Miami, Florida. You know, as Gunther said, my family is Cuban. You know, they all had to flee here after the Cuban Revolution in 1959. You know, fleeing persecution, fleeing the tyranny. The lack of food, of resources, of really any kind of hope for a future life. And I was I was blessed to have been born and raised in the United States. I consider it one of the great blessings anybody can have, to grow up in and be a citizen of the free world. And not have to fear political repression, or to have to sort of worry about the basic necessities of life, which unfortunately they still have to worry about in Cuba.
In which beautiful state have you grown up?
In Florida.
Oh, it's like many Cuban Americans. Your family fled to Florida?
Yeah, to Miami, yeah.
When did your family flee? Was it directly after the Fidel Castro communist revolution in 57, 58? Or when was exactly the leaving point?
Different parts of my family came at different points. So, like, my father's side of the family left shortly thereafter. My maternal grandmother left in 1960, so only about a year after the revolution. And then my mother's side of the family left in 1973.
Good, and you are all settled in Florida and hopefully voting for Marco Rubio when he was the senator, because he is the big champion of the liberation of Cuba. We will discuss that in a moment, but please continue. You are also politically active, I understand.
Yeah, I'm the president of the Turning Point USA chapter here at Claremont McKenna College in beautiful Southern California, which is where I am now, and I'm also the secretary of the College Republicans chapter.
Very good. We will not go in detail about Turning Point USA, but I'm sorry that your president was killed last year. That was a terrible act of terrorism. I'm very sorry for that.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the College Republicans. You're the chairman of your chapter there? Is it very active at your university?
I'm the secretary. I'm the secretary. So I'm a few rungs below that, but I would say that we're pretty active. We bring speakers and such. We're a relatively new chapter. We were refounded about a year ago now. And we've been working. We've been attracting a lot of ire, as it were, from other people on the colleges. I would say that Claremont McKenna's the student body is probably a little bit more conservative than most other universities, and especially most other liberal arts colleges in the country, especially in California. But I would still say overall that it's still quite liberal. And then we also have four other liberal arts colleges around us, the Claremont colleges, and that's where I suppose a lot of the more very left-wing people and end up coming from.
I can feel with you because I was a student activist, a conservative student activist as well in my student times in the 90s, and it was never easy to bring our position to the universities, and I'm sure that's a big effort also today. I guess a lot of pro-Palestinian demonstrations at your college.
Yes, yes. So in my time here, I'm currently a sophomore. In my time here, about a year and a half, little less than year and a half ago now, on October the 7th, 2024, on the 1 year anniversary of the horrific attacks, these a group of students basically raided one of the buildings, Carnegie Hall at Pomona College, which was a Carnegie Library. It's a historic building, and they raided the building. They vandalized it, graffiti, all these sorts of things, such that the classes that were going on at that time ended up having to be canceled.
Right, yeah, it's not easy. Let me ask you, because you're from the Young Republicans now, and we have a little bit of an issue. Some chapters of the Young Republicans are inviting the so-called patriots for Europe, which we see as traitors to Europe, to attend their meetings. And I want to know how you feel about it. Do you see Europeans as your allies, or as somehow lazy buggers who live off American generosity? Or how do you feel towards Europe?
I think that Europe is immensely important. I think it's the birthplace of Western civilization. I think even if you want to say in terms of national security, I think that you could certainly say that perhaps towards NATO contributions and such, that a lot of European countries haven't been fully pulling their weight. I think that's a legitimate complaint, but I think that to sort of abandon NATO to the dogs, as it were, to the Russians, I think would be a horrific mistake. And I think that it is certainly in the interests of the United States to make sure that Europe is defended, and that it stays free and prosperous. And I think that I would like to see probably more of a stepping up from Europe. I think that as much as I might disagree with the tactics of Trump in securing that, and I have very mixed feelings towards Trump. I think that there is there have been, at least partially, some results of that, even if I don't necessarily like the tactics from that. But like I said, I think that Europe is immensely important. I think NATO is incredibly important, and I think that it's immensely important to make sure that it stays free. Because for us as Americans, that's part of our history, our heritage, and I think that anyone that considers themselves an American patriot should of course have a great love for Europe.
Thanks a lot, Gabe. I wish you very good luck with your political career. We need more Republicans like you, and I hope you will have a future in the US Congress and be happily supporting Europeans. We need politicians like you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Let's now discuss about what we agreed to discuss about Cuba. The situation is quite dramatic. We have now the fall of Maduro at the beginning of the year 26, and basically the Americans' Navy is controlling the oil export, so no oil for Cuba anymore. How do you see the situation in Cuba? What is your view, and do you support regime change and freedom for Cuba?
Well, of course I support regime change. I think that, Marco Rubio, I think, probably put it beautifully the other day when he was asked in Congress, he was asked by a senator, will we say that, we will not commit to looking to catalyze regime change in Cuba? And I think his response was perfect. Of course we'd like to see the regime change there. I think that should certainly be the goal for any American. I mean, we have a communist dictatorship that murders its own people, that starves them 90 miles off the coast. I think that's horrific. I remember when I first got the news about the fall of Maduro, it was actually was actually Shiv that told me he was in Israel at the time. And I woke up and I got the text, from him, and I see all of the notifications on my phone from all of the news agencies saying, Shiv's text was something like, Venezuela is free, and I see from all the news, U.S. Special Forces like captured Maduro in like a clandestine operation, and I was just. I was just amazed, and as the news kept coming in, that it took only a matter of a few hours that, we endured 0 casualties, all of these things, I was just amazed. I had actually written an article a few months ago, back in October, for one of the student newspapers here, basically directly calling for and advocating for, U.S. intervention of some sort in Venezuela. And, I was just even surprised that just going in and kidnapping Maduro was even an option, but I definitely think that, that was magnificent, and I think that the way that we've been handling, trying to transition Venezuela into, away from communism and towards hopefully capitalist liberal democracy, I think, we're going very carefully and cautiously about it, which I think is probably the right approach based on how that regime was constructed. And I think that hopefully the message to the Escanel and to the regime in Cuba should be, time's up, basically.
Yes, many people have criticized the Trump administration because they ultimately didn't really regime change the whole regime, and Mrs. Machado couldn't return up to now, and there are no plan for free and fair elections, which would be normally the case in order to have a legitimate governance. What is your future prediction? Do you think that this will all happen later in 2026? Or do you think Trump will leave this unrepentant communist Lucy Rodriguez in power?
Well, I think, I definitely think that you're going to see elections either maybe 2026 or, we'll see however long it takes. I mean, the thing is, with how that regime was constructed, is that, they very much to an extent sort of coup-proofed it. Like there are more generals in Venezuela than there are in all of NATO combined, which is just ridiculous just from any perspective. But, the fact is, that was done very, very intentionally to sort of prevent the ability for a coup, especially after, I forget if it was 2002 or 2003, where there was a coup against Hugo Chavez that ultimately ended in short term. It was successful for like a few days, but ultimately it ended up with a sort of long-term failure. And really in the aftermath of that, Chavez, and then especially later on Maduro really took to a lot of lengths to prevent that, because in order for a coup to happen, you need a certain percentage of the military on board, and if you sort of fracture the military into however many hundred generals, it's hard to get that sort of consensus there. But ultimately, I think the goal is to prevent another Iraq, where we went in, we killed Saddam, we captured and then killed Saddam, and then ultimately left a sort of power vacuum in the wake, with really no structure there. I think Venezuela is a very, very different situation from Iraq, but I think the concern of it devolving into civil war is definitely very real, and I think that avoiding that while still trying to get it on the path to a functioning democracy like how it was before Chavez is the goal, and I think we're going to I think we are ultimately going to see that. I think that what the capture of Maduro shows is that effectively, the regime has more or less to an extent been kind of neutered. Delcy Rodriguez really can't do much of anything. She can't really do much of anything in terms of trying to oppose Trump, because, if it was that easy to just capture Maduro, I can't, I imagine everybody else in that regime, and that includes, Rodriguez, Diosdado, Cabello, and all the others should certainly look to that as, that can happen to you too.
Okay, let's see. The future for Venezuela will be anyhow in our timelines in 2026. Let me ask you now about the consequences this has for Cuba. What's exactly the link between Venezuela and Cuba?
Well, like even just looking at the operation that captured Maduro, we killed about 100 or so people during the course of that operation. I believe 33 or 32 or so of which were Cubans. Like the Venezuela is functionally and has been a Cuban colony. The entire security apparatus of Venezuela was sort of colonized by Cubans. It's all a bunch of Cubans, pretty much just running the show there. Cuba is completely dependent on Venezuelan oil exports, to survive. Mexican as well, but uh, that looks like it's ending now. Mexico will be looking like it's ending its oil exports to Cuba, but other things as well. I think are really sort of beginning to spell the end. It's really looking like it's the beginning of what has of what should hopefully be the end for the Cuban regime. I I have high hopes. I remember when Marco Rubio, the announcement of Marco Rubio first coming out as his nomination, that he would be Secretary of State. I remember sort of immediately thinking I was very very happy and very very hopeful first that it was Marco Rubio and not someone that was like a crazy isolationist. But I remember saying to myself, well, I think that the odds of communism collapsing in Cuba, within the next 4 years are certainly going to be very high. And if he gets it done in year two, I think that would certainly be tremendous. Obviously, he's also Cuban as well. He's a Miami Cuban. He's like me, and like so many other people from Miami. He shares that same background, and so obviously, of course, I imagine that him looking to Cuba, to try and catalyze regime change there should absolutely be on the top of his mind.
Let me ask you about the situation. How do people live in Cuba at the moment? Yeah, because a lot of Europeans actually have been on holiday there. They have maybe good memories of Cuba because it's possible to go. I was personally in '96 as a tourist as well in Cuba, and I have, of course, these memories of poverty and injustice. But it's also a wonderful island in principle and nice people. So to invade it or to regime change it is always a big thing, as you have mentioned with Iraq. Many people in Europe were against that operation as well. So is it really so bad, the human rights situation, the economic situation? Because we have heard about some openings of the system after the death of Fidel Castro. So explain a little bit. I guess you will have some family there or you have some reports. What exactly is the human rights and the economic situation in Cuba today?
Well, what I've always heard from my family, is that to my knowledge at least, all of my family from Cuba are they were either killed, executed, or they managed to escape. So, in terms of on the ground personal knowledge, you know, I, from that I've heard directly from members of my family, it goes back to when they left. But even then, like I know people in Miami that left Cuba like quite recently. Like there are always people coming over on rafts really since the '90s coming over, trying to get a better life for themselves. The economic situation is completely horrific. Sort of prior to the revolution, Cuba and the United States had a deal where we would buy a lot of Cuban sugar, and that really did sustain the Cuban economy. It was very, very good. And so after the revolution, after Castro took over, we sort of ended that deal. But the thing is, the Soviet Union stepped in and pretty much just kept subsidizing the Cuban economy in the same way. After the fall of the Soviet Union, that money pretty much dried up, and Cuba entered what it called the special period, which essentially was a famine of sorts. Complete economic collapse, more or less. But and people started saying Cubans in Miami started saying exiles. The line was borrowing from sort of how the Jews had spent so many centuries, millennia in diaspora. Next year in Havana, and that didn't. Unfortunately, it didn't end up happening that way. Because they sort of figured out, that tourism was a new avenue that they could do to sort of get around this. There have been some mild economic reforms, but it's still very much a communist state. It's still quite horrific, you know, and it's not really to the benefit of anybody. You know, like I said, I know people, you know, that come across, you know, that came across, you know, quite recently from Cuba, and it's really not much better. It's still quite terrible. And then really after the pandemic, you saw sort of the tourism industry start to dry up, and you know, it's pretty much in just there's functionally no economy in Cuba, and you know what they say is, and you know this seems to at least be mostly true, is that the regime is at its weakest point ever, which certainly hopes to be the case, and I certainly hope that we do see the end of it this year.
So you do think that the level of repression and economic misery is justifying such a because de facto energy embargo on Cuba is a very tough measure also for the population of Cuba, because they cannot drive anymore. They have then restrictions in mobility already. So you think the level of political suppression in Cuba is so bad that it's justified to have that misery, and ultimately the regime will collapse?
Well, I don't think that necessarily. I really don't think that the U.S. embargo on Cuba does really kind of play any kind of a role in it. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Cuba can trade with any other country in the world as it pleases, you know, and they do. Like they trade with Canada, they trade with Mexico, obviously with Europe, you know, all of these sorts of things, and you know, you know they can still get products from America. Just you know, it's just through an intermediary. The fact is, being able to trade with the United States would not change the fact of just horrific misery economically. I mean, you know, communism has failed horrifically everywhere and every time it's been tried. You know, and if you're a communist state, and you know, if you want to blame the United States, the largest capitalist country on earth, for your misery, then I think that that implicitly is an admission of the failure of communism to, in any case, be able to sustain itself.
Is there any kind, because I'm asking you now about the possible successor regime, is there any kind of leading opposition politician in the Cuban diaspora in Florida? Is there some kind of exile government? Or what kind of political system would Cuba have after a transition towards a democracy? And which personalities would lead it?
Well, you know, like we'll see. You know, like there are a few figures out there. You know, a lot of them. You know, in terms of the exile community, in the diaspora, I would definitely say, you know, the one that we all look to really is Marco Rubio. You know, I remember.
He's already having plans to be U.S. president, so I think he will not go to be the president of Free Cuba.
Well, we'll see. You know, he did write in his, I believe it was in 2012, in his book that you know when he was very young, that he wrote about, you know, and he told his grandfather that, you know, he dreamed of one day leading an army of Cuban exiles to Cuba, and you know, becoming the president of a free Cuba. So you know, we'll see.
It
You know,
worked so well in the Bay of Pigs, unfortunately, in '61.
yes, unfortunately, yes.
Kennedy
You know,
bungled it.
oh, completely. Yeah. You know, this is of course the reason why so many Cubans in America are, you know, happen to, you know, despise or hate John F. Kennedy because of the failure of the Bay of Pigs, because of his complete bungling of it, his, you know, his withdrawal of air support, you know, his pretty much changing the plans, you know, just all of that, you know, it's just such a horrific failure, you know, and it begins as the catalyst for why Cubans, you know, are sort of an outlier amongst many other Hispanic or Latino groups in America in terms of the strong Republican lean.
On a political concept, you know, because in Eastern Europe, after the Soviet Union fell in '91, all of the countries were liberated, from Ukraine to Eastern Germany, from Estonia to Bulgaria, and it all worked actually very well. They have joined NATO, EU, we had the economic support for them, and it was actually a really big success story of freedom in Eastern Europe. But I've never understood why exactly this small island in the Caribbean, Cuba, has basically stayed with the communists. So can you give an explanation why, different to Eastern Europe, in the Caribbean, the communism has survived?
Well, I would say that I think I blame it largely on a failure of other Western countries really to completely condemn the regime. You know, for one reason or another. I remember after Fidel Castro died, in 2016. I remember, on the streets of Miami, people were celebrating, people were banging pots and pans. It was a very happy day, as it were. And you saw much of the same thing after the capture of Maduro. Because Castro was just such a horrific, dictator, just a horrific person in general. And is responsible for so much misery, and for us, for so many of us, having to leave our homes for the death of a lot of people, a lot of family members, you know. But I think it's largely been a fail, But I remember after he died, even as people were celebrating in Miami, I remember Justin Trudeau, and the Canadian government sent out a statement basically praising Castro, saying he was a great liberator, and basically essentially sending their condolences to Cuba about it, and it reminded me of how the Irish, Ireland under Eamon de Valera, after the death of Hitler, sent a statement, to the people of Germany, sending their condolences about, the death of Hitler. Like that. That's
That
ultimately
was
really
really
how
bad.
it felt.
I really
Yes.
don't like the Irish and their neutrality and their policy in World War II up to now. I'm really upset about the Irish. I'm happy. We agree on that one. What do you think
Yeah.
about the Greek socialist leader, Mr. Tsipras, attending the funeral of Fidel Castro in 2016 and saying some nice things there at his eulogy?
Well, I mean, I would say to him, and quite frankly to every single person living in the United States, living in Europe, Canada, wherever, that actually looks to Castro, looks to Cuba as a great this beacon of freedom against American imperialism and such. Actually try and live there. Don't go there as a tourist. Actually, because they cover, because of course they try and make it look nice for the tourists. Actually try and live there. Actually talk to people who had to escape Cuba. I remember, my mother, she left in '73. She first left to, she first escaped to Spain, and in Cuba they have ration cards. Pretty much you get a certain amount of food, and when my mother first saw a supermarket in Spain for the first time, she asked my grandmother, you know, you know, basically, what about our ration? What about, our cards, our ration cards? And my grandmother said to her, no sea wajida, which is, don't be a hick, basically, or don't be like, a kind of,
Not even
I
in
don't know.
Spain they have ration cards anymore in that list.
No, no. I don't know, hick, I guess, sort of like an uncult, like hillbilly, redneck, if you will, sort of like I don't mean to be offensive or anything, but, sort of like,
No, we
like a
had the
less
same with
cultured sort of
Eastern
person.
Germans in the year 1990 going to Western
Yeah,
Germany and being completely surprised about the freedom, the consumption opportunities. And of course, this is what freedom is about, very much so.
of
So,
course.
what's your message to European left-wing young people who love Che Guevara?
Che Guevara, tortured and murdered my family. So every time I see his, his likeness on anything, that famous image of him, you know, it, I'm filled with a certain amount of just, quite frankly, rage, because like I said, he tortured and he killed my family, and to see people celebrating him, as some sort of great hero, or as some sort of great liberator, is just so contrary to the reality of who he was, And I would also encourage them to look up what he said, because so many of them also care about, gay rights and stuff, I would encourage them to look up what he said about gay people as well. He was not a great liberator. He was not a hero, and he should not be seen as such. he was a monster. You know, he was he was a person that was responsible for the death and starvation of so many people. And for the executions of so many. You know, he personally oversaw a lot of the executions of political prisoners in Cuba after the revolution.
Do you think that Cuba has a great economic future, political future as a free country, and it will be economically successful? And will the United States of America support a free and democratic Cuba?
I think so. I think that the road to being a fully prosperous and successful nation, you know, like anything that's worth doing, like any worthy undertaking, as it were. It's going to be difficult, but the work is absolutely, should absolutely be undertaken. You know, Cuba's the infrastructure is decrepit. You know, it's falling apart. You know, what I've heard, from people is, that in Cuba, power is so rare that and blackouts are just the norm. That it's more rare to have power. They call them white-ins or whiteouts. Rather than having blackouts basically. But I think being able to show the success of capitalism, of Western style liberal democracy, and I absolutely think that Cuba can thrive. I think that it can have a wonderful economic future under it. If you want to say, there are some criticisms of how Cuba, was economically and politically prior to the revolution. You can criticize Batista and such. Like the mafia basically ran Havana when Batista was in charge, to put it lightly. If you've seen The Godfather Part 2, but to put it bluntly, the mafia ran it better than Castro, is how I would say. Obviously, we don't want it to be a government that is run by criminals, but I think that we can absolutely have a successful future. Tourism.
I was personally in Cuba in '96, and the city of Havana. It is principally a very beautiful city at the ocean and with this old Malecon. But when you saw the city, the buildings, they were originally like the buildings were from the 1950s. And they looked very much like Berlin in 1945, because there was no single window there. Every house was completely destroyed, and it looked like a really bombed city. Like there was no investment since 50 or 60 years at that stage. And also the cars looked really, really the same one, like in a time machine, like from a 1950s movie. You had the same cars, and this was the only cars available actually, and you were lucky to find one. So I have
Yeah.
not seen, even in Eastern Europe after communism, and I've traveled to all Eastern European countries after communism in the 90s. I have not a single place which was in such a terrible state in the 1990s. And I guess it's quite the same still today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like as you said, it's falling apart. I remember, Daniel Di Martino, who's a Venezuelan exile, who works for the Manhattan Institute. He sort of pointed out that the Venezuelan refugee crisis is currently the largest refugee crisis in the world, and if you look at like the biggest refugee crises in history, it's the only one that has never that is not that has not been caused by a war. So like it's more people have left Venezuela as a result of communism there than people that left Syria following the civil war there. And if you were to look at the numbers since '59 to present day, I'm sure you would get similar numbers to Cuba. One of my professors, he taught in Ukraine shortly after the fall of the Soviet Union, and for about a year or so, I think about a year or two, and he told me that pretty much anybody that was really above the age of 27 there was it was pretty much sort of unhirable, that had not lived through, that, had not at least grown, that had lived under when the harshest of the repressions, that didn't grow up under Gorbachev, under, being able to benefit from glasnost and perestroika. It's sort of, they were just sort of unhirable just because of the sort of spiritual damage that communism even does to you, beyond even the economic, beyond even the material. It really does damage your soul, I think, and I think that's absolutely the case with that, and I think you have, I think, I think anyone that values freedom, anyone that values democracy and knows the value of it, I think we in the West do take it for granted. I think that we take for granted the benefits that we have to live in such a wonderful system, where we can have electricity and power, and that we can pretty much speak freely and talk our minds. I think that we take that for granted, and I think that people don't understand how rare that is in today's world, but especially don't understand that is extremely abnormal throughout human history.
When it comes to the transition of Cuba to democracy, would the United States of America accept European Union help? Because currently our situation, our relation is very complicated. But in the European Union, we have 13 countries who have transitioned from communism towards market economy. We have a lot of experienced administrators and politicians who know exactly how to transform a communist country into a free market economy with flat tax, with economic stability, growth, privatization. And this knowledge is very rare in the United States of America, because you are a much more advanced economy. And also you have a little bit, there is always a little bit of competition between the North and South of America in terms of English speaking, Spanish speaking, and in terms of a little bit of cultural prejudices between the North and the South. And you are perceived maybe as Yankees and as the gringos. And don't you think that it will be necessary to involve European partners in reforming Cuba after the fall of communism? Or will Mr. Trump not like any Europeans messing around in his Cuba?
Well, I mean, I imagine I imagine that certainly you'll probably see the United States take the lead. Particularly, I would imagine Marco Rubio especially would certainly look to take the lead on that. But I think that any help, I say this as a Cuban American, I say this, any help to try and fix the Cuban economy would certainly greatly be appreciated. I think I don't know the extent to which maybe some people would actually maybe look to return to Cuba following perhaps a transition to democracy there, to try and help fix the country. I don't know the number, but I certainly would like to try and see if I could do anything as an American, but I have family buried there, and
you are bilingual. You were raised in English and Spanish.
Yeah, Spanish is my first language. I learned English, and then I also happen to know French.
So you understood this bunny at the Super Bowl.
Yes.
Lucky you. Not everybody seemingly did that in the United States. Anyhow.
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
You like the performance?
I like his music. I wouldn't say that I necessarily agree with his politics, but I like his music. I'm a fan. I thought that it was.
I don't torture you and ask you if you're in favor of Puerto Rico becoming the 51st member state of the United States of America. But some of you who listen might know that I'm very much in favor of exactly that policy, that America should first take Puerto Rico as 51st before messing around with Greenland, which we were not so happy about in this spectacular start of 2026. But more serious, I ask you, Gabe, about the situation of the Cuban Americans in Florida. What's your voting pattern? What's your economic situation? Are the Cubans in Florida successful economically? Are they well integrated? Do they feel as Americans? And what's in general their voting pattern? Will they vote and stay with the Republicans? Will they go Democrat? what's the future of Florida, because Florida had always an extremely important role in American presidential politics. I remember very much the year 2000 and this big thing of the 150 votes, I think it was, which decided for George Bush against Al Gore. So Florida really matters in America. And so the Floridan Americans matter very much. So my question is, how do they live? How much do they feel as Americans, as Cubans? And what do they vote in general?
Well, I would say Cuban Americans are, I think, I don't, I can't say this for certain, but I'm almost, I haven't myself looked at the data that recently, but I'm probably willing to say that Cuban Americans are one of, if not probably the most successful Latino group in the United States. And the Miami-Dade County is, I think, about 50% Cuban American, and I think about 50% of all Cuban Americans live in Miami-Dade County. So I would say Miami was sort of like a sort of swamp or a backwater prior to the arrival of the Cubans, if you will, and what you really see is that is a real building up of the city, and it becoming Miami's a very wealthy, very 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 it's a wonderful city. I say this with a great deal of love. I grew up there, so I love my city. But it's a genuinely wonderful city to grow up in. It's beautiful. It's especially in the last few years. You're seeing like a real bunch of investment in it. I mean, people want to live in Florida. Florida is a great state to live in. It's got low taxes. It's got nice warm weather. It's a nice city to live in. And Miami's a spectacular city to live in. It's a spectacular city to grow up in. Voting wise, Cubans are, very, very conservative, pretty strongly Republican, especially, in the last two presidential elections, 2020 and 2024, broke heavily for Donald Trump, such that, in just large numbers, I think that pretty much every single Cuban American in Miami loves America. They love being able to come here and actually be able to prosper and be successful and have a life, and which is obviously not something that they can do in Cuba. I think the question of integration is an interesting one, because one of the larger areas in Miami-Dade County is a city called Hialeah, which I think is about 500,000 people live there, and I think 88% of the population of Hialeah, something like that, is either Cuban or of Cuban descent. So, and it's an interesting place, because these people, people in Hialeah, Cuban Americans in general, are some of the most patriotic people that you'll ever meet. They really do love America, which I think it's a unique kind of patriotism that I think arises when out of the experience of being a refugee, out of having to leave your home country, and it's a sort of gratitude that you get, because how bad the alternative is, how rare what you have here is, and you really do cherish it. That's not to imply or to put down that people that were born here aren't any less patriotic, but it's a different sort of patriotism, I would say, and even many of them, I would say, also a large number of them don't speak English, but even then, I think you really do see among them just this great sense of just loving America, and they also love Donald Trump. And I can only imagine how much more people love, Cuban Americans love Trump. I'm probably on the sort of, relatively speaking, I probably, have probably less war. On the average, I probably am on the lower end of having lower feelings, warmer feelings for Trump. But even I would probably say that I still broadly support most of the, not all, but a good number of the things he's doing, especially in regards to foreign policy. I would say,
What is more important for the Cuban Americans? Because Trump is perceived, and obviously with Minnesota, with the ICE crackdowns, he is perceived as very anti-migrant, and this is part of his platform to reduce migrant. And then also he has made these remarks about Spanish not being the language to be spoken at the Super Bowl. So there are some kind of on that balance sheet. On the other side, he has liberated Maduro, also Venezuela, and he has taken down Maduro, and the hopes are there. So will the Cuban Americans stay with Trump despite all the scandals and the ICE, or will they go to the Democrats?
I think that, I think that, Cuban Americans are very likely to stick with Trump, especially after Venezuela. And if he manages to topple the Cuban regime after, so long and so many years of it, I can only imagine how much further solidly Cubans will be for the Republicans.
So no matter
Because
ICE, no matter Spanish or not, when he topples Cuba, Trump will be extremely popular in the Cuban American population.
oh, certainly. Anyone that whichever president was going to do it, even if it had been Biden, I imagine, if it had been Biden to actually, liberate Cuba, I would imagine that, that he would have just all of a sudden become immensely popular amongst Cuban Americans. But Trump already started from a very large base of support, I would say. He's a very, you know, he's a very good showman. Say whatever else what you will about him, but I think that for us, for most Cubans, I say this of my own family and of most people, there was a policy in the United States that was very, very lenient towards Cuban Americans, and I think that allowed us to get residency and then eventually citizenship in relatively short manner because of the situation in which we came here. So for those reasons, I would say that Cubans, generally speaking, immigration is not as, I mean, it's something of an issue, but it's not as pressing of an issue as it might be for, say, someone that's Mexican. But I would also at the same time say that Cubans also have been, I would sort of describe us as in many ways sort of having been burned by a lot of previous Democratic administrations. We talked about Kennedy earlier with the failure of the Bay of Pigs, but even beyond that, Bill Clinton, with the removal of Elian Gonzalez, and sending him back to Cuba against the wishes of so much of the Cuban community in Miami, and then Obama with the sort of Cuban thaw that was sort of trying to cozy up to Castro was sort of entrenched that
That
further and
was a
further.
disaster, Obama.
Oh, completely. But I can speak for myself. I understand. I'm sure many more Cubans would probably feel the same. That for the first time in my lifetime, I've been saying this since the fall of Maduro. For the first time in my life, I genuinely feel that that I will probably be able to finally go back to Cuba, go to Cuba because I've never been. I will finally be able to go to Cuba. I think hopefully this year, and that's not something that I've been able to say any other year that I've been alive. And for Cubans that matters a lot. For the people that actually came from Cuba, but also I would say for the sons, and the children of people of exiles that were born here, that being able to go back, or to go, like to go and to where to the island where to the country where so many of our families are from, where we have family members that are buried there, that we have a very strong, intense connection to, and be able to, to be able to, walk on a free Cuba, to be able to walk on free Cuban soil and breathe free Cuban air, I think would, that matters to people, and it certainly matters. It matters to me a lot.
I would also forgive Trump a lot of his antiques if he liberates Cuba, because that's a historic achievement. And Maduro is already a plus point. And if now Cuba falls and there will be a democratic, free market economy in Cuba, I would also applaud President Trump a lot.
Of course. I mean, I saw, I think it was Bill Maher, big liberal who, who he himself is, has been very, very, very critical of Trump over the years. Certainly, no ally or anything like that, or any kind of ideological friend of Trump. Even he said that, if this year, if Trump manages to bring about the collapse of the regimes in in Venezuela, and then also hopefully Iran, and then also Cuba, in addition to, of course, Venezuela, that he would deserve the Nobel Peace Prize, and I would completely agree. Obviously, Maria Corina Machado, who was the most recent winner, she herself said that he deserved it, and she did when she got the prize, she dedicated it to him, and then obviously after the operation that kidnapped Maduro, she gave her physical prize to him.
Do you think he will do regime change in Iran?
I certainly hope so. I think that one of the great tools in the arsenal of Donald Trump, is sort of his unpredictability. Going back to President Nixon, sort of the madman theory. Where you just kind of act in such a manner that nobody really knows what you're going to do next. I think that it is, there's something to that I think is perhaps quite effective. At times, I might disagree with sort of the minutia or a lot of how Trump does that and executes that, but I think that that's a tool in the arsenal. I think with the, he's moved carriers into the Persian Gulf, and I think that if he moves them without doing some sort of change there, or without striking there, I think that would certainly be a show of weakness. And I think that one of the things that I can feel that I can safely say about Donald Trump is that he doesn't like to appear weak, and I think that it would be a tremendous show of weakness if we don't do some sort of action to help the protesters in Iran. I think it would be a tremendous show of weakness for him, but also, for the United States and for the West in general. I think,
Remember, 2013 was Obama in the White House. He went around in the Rose Garden. He decided not to intervene in Syria after Assad had put some perils on her own people and has put poison gas against the people. And then suddenly Putin felt emboldened to intervene in Syria, in Ukraine, take Crimea. And suddenly we had a very difficult decade of Russian resurgence because of American weakness and non-intervention.
Right, of course. I think that the nuclear deal that Obama negotiated with Iran and the annexation of Crimea were just terrible. Very much the reason why Obama pretty much did nothing about the annexation of Crimea was just because he wanted Russia on board for the nuclear deal with Iran, which was a complete disaster. And I think that Trump tore up the nuclear deal, which was tremendous, and I have hopes that he won't make the same mistake that Obama did. I think I certainly think that with Marco Rubio, he's not going to. Marco Rubio, I remember sort of his speech, decrying the nuclear deal, sort of was making the rounds on Twitter the other day, and I think and I don't think that we're going to see the same mistake. I think that from us, that are sort of observers that don't have an inside knowledge, I think it might look a little, I think that it's easy to sort of criticize the way things are going, right now. But I think also the thing is, yes, with Iran is that we just don't have a lot of information. Obviously the regime there shut down internet access, all these other sorts of things. And, so I don't know what's we don't know a lot of what's happening in Iran. Certainly I think we can hope that, that there is a plan to bring freedom to the Iranian people. I think that would be a tremendous benefit to the United States. This horrific regime that is really the sponsor of so much terrorism around the world, especially in the Middle East. if that could be brought down and replaced with a good, strong ally of the United States that values freedom, that values liberty, that wants to, that is actually interested in doing good for the benefit of the people there, rather than just, imposing this horrific rule there, I think would be tremendous. You mentioned that you're going to Munich tomorrow for the security conference. I believe Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi is also going to be there, and I believe Marco Rubio is also going to be there. So hopefully something comes out of that. I think. I think, and perhaps I feel like one has to hope that there is a greater strategy in all of this. That the goal is to bring about regime change in Iran, in the long term, and that this is just sort of this is one way or another just to kind of sort of confuse them, hopefully, and is all part of a greater strategy to do it. And I think that hopefully by the end of the year, I certainly hope that we will be speaking of Shah Reza Pahlavi, as it were. That we will be speaking of Iran as a free and hopefully secular democracy, and that Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei is either in Moscow with Assad, or underground, or is dead.
That would be perfect, yeah. Let's hope it is like this. Your wish may be command to the Lord. Let me ask you about Ukraine, because we are now alone with Ukraine, and Mr. Trump is somehow MIA, as you say in military language, missing in action. He is just making deals behind our back with the Russians, or whatever they are doing in these negotiations. We are not involved, and we just yesterday decided to put another 90 billion euro to keep Ukraine in the fight, and it's a heroic fight. They have to be supported, and America is the city of the hill, the defense of global freedom, and we need you back in the fight.
No, certainly. I mean, I think that in so many ways, what's happening in Ukraine, and I would also say what's happening in Iran and in Israel, it's very much, those are really the front lines, I would say, of the defense of Western civilization. I think that Volodymyr Zelensky is, I believe, the moral equivalent of George Washington, and I really do think that allowing Russia to just take Ukraine, would be horrific, both from a national security standpoint, but also just from the human standpoint. I think that the way that the war has sort of turned out is that the front lines are more or less static, and I think that as much as I would love to see all of the the Donbass and Zaporizhia and all of the other occupied regions of Ukraine, and of course Crimea, as much as I would love to see them free of Russian tyranny, and also of course I would also like to see Putin removed from office. I think that one also has to be realistic about the situation, and at least the way that it's looking is the front lines are not moving. And ultimately, I think that the only thing that you can do at that point is try and prevent more death. Hopefully, I would, in an ideal world, I would like to see the end of the war result in, the complete withdrawal of all Russian troops from the occupied territories, from Crimea, from the Donbass, and of course for Ukrainian entry into NATO. But I think, in a realistic way, unfortunately, I say this with tremendous regret, and genuinely so, unfortunately, that it doesn't look like that might be possible, and that I think that what you can do is you can try and protect and save what might be left of Ukraine, cut your losses, and I do hate to say it, but perhaps admit that you're unfortunately not getting the occupied territories back in exchange for allowing Ukraine into NATO and the EU, or for essentially just security guarantees that would amount up to the same thing.
Okay, in 2027 there will be speculation who will be the next presidential candidate of the Conservative Party, of the GOP, and there will be the primaries. Now, on the big question, Rubio, Marco versus JD Vance, where do you stand?
I don't think that Marco Rubio is going to run. I think that, I think that I think he could certainly put up a fight. And to be, I'll say that, if he runs, I would support him. I just don't think he is going to in the political calculus. You know, Trump has sort of talked about potentially those two running, with Marco Rubio as vice president, with JD Vance as president. I myself would rather prefer to see Marco Rubio stay on as Secretary of State. I think that he's done a tremendous job in that role. And I think that I would love to see him continue in that. We'll see what ends up happening. I think like I said, I don't think that Marco Rubio is going to run. But like I said, if he does run, I would support him.
And we support Gabe. Thanks a lot for this debate. It was very interesting discussion. We have spent 1 hour together now, and we discussed about the Cuban liberation, which is hopefully to come, about the situation of Cuban Americans, and also about Iran and Ukraine. And I see a very inspiring young friend of NATO and of Europe here in Florida growing up. I have to say thank you very much for you, and please some closing statement from your side, Gabe, and then we conclude the show.
Well, thank you very much, Gunther. Hopefully, pretty much as long as I can remember, and as long as I've been alive, I've been hoping for change in Cuba, and for the first time ever, I think that might finally come this year. And certainly by year's end, when that day comes, when when the Escanel, and the whole communist regime there falls, that is going to be one of the happiest days of my life, and I look forward to hopefully, going to the country where my mother was born, where my grandparents were born, and finally being able to see with my own eyes that country, and I might, I don't always agree with Donald Trump, but if he is able to do that, then I would be immensely indebted to him, and and of course I hope for the freedom of so many other nations that are also living under tyranny. Hopefully we will see Venezuela be completely free. It's on the road there, I think, to that, but I think that we are going to see free Venezuela hopefully soon, maybe by year's end. And then hopefully we also see a free Iran, hopefully as well a free Belarus, and so many other nations, and hopefully an end to tyranny around the world.
You're a cool man. I approve. Gabe, bravo. Thanks a lot for joining Günther Fehlinger podcast, our show tonight, and all the best, and may freedom win against tyranny everywhere in the world. And I will hope you will come to my show when you're in Cuba after liberation, and we make another live show together.
Let's do it then.
Thanks a lot. All the best.
All the best to you as well, Gunther.